Welcome to Neuroscience 101. Oh. The only neuroscience we're going to do in this course is looking into the minds of Supreme Court justices when they try to figure out what to do about freedom of speech and the press, which is a subject that has been dear to my heart as a lawyer, as a sometimes journalist, as a teacher, and above all as a citizen. I practiced law for 45 years. You can do the math. Most of my career was spent on civil rights and civil liberties cases, including, especially for the last 25 years or so, First Amendment cases, freedom of speech and the press. And some of the cases and issues that we'll consider in the course are ones that I was personally involved in. As a journalist, I don't pretend ever to have been a real journalist. I did work for KQED Channel 9 in San Francisco for several years back in the day when they had a daily news program on Channel 9 back in the 70s, and I reported the legal news for them. Supreme Court decision would come down and I would come on and try to explain it. And then I did about 10 documentaries on legal subjects for Channel 9 up until the 80s. And the last thing I did was 4 hours on PBS on the bicentennial of the Constitution. When was that? When was the Constitution 200 years old? 1987. 1787 is when they met that hot summer in Philadelphia and hammered out the Constitution that we still live under. The Bill of Rights with the First Amendment came a little later after the ratification battle. As a teacher, I've been teaching something about the First Amendment for, this is the 26th year now at Cal, starting in the journalism school, in the graduate school of journalism, and then for the last 20 years or so undergraduate. And finally, as a citizen, I think it's real important that everybody understand the First Amendment, what the freedom of speech and the press really means. Former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman on the Supreme Court, now retired, made a speech a couple of years ago in which she lamented the lack of understanding of our civil liberties and where they came from. And she said that to preserve the system of government we have to start with the education of our nation's young people. Knowledge about our government is not handed down through the gene pool. Every generation has to learn it, and we have some work to do. And she gave as an example a poll, and I'm going to replicate the poll right here and now. How many of you can name at least one of the judges on American Idol? How many don't know any of the judges on American Idol? Couldn't name one. Oh, really? Oh, 5, 6. Remarkable. Times are changing. How many of you who know who at least one of the judges could name all three? The three, aren't there? Right? Yeah. How many can name all three? Some faithful. Justice O'Connor lamented that, what were her figures? 2/3 of Americans know at least one of the judges on American Idol, but less than 1 in 10 can name the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. How many of you can name the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court? 2, 4. We have some work to do. Well, let's look at these guys. Here's what the current court looks like. This is not the New York Yankees or the Stockton Elks Club. It's the Supreme Court of the United States. And you ought to know who these people are because they have enormous power and influence in our society, and especially over things like the Constitution and its interpretation. The Chief Justice is John Roberts, appointed by George W. Bush. And he sits in the middle, but he's not the oldest. Just starting on this end and working this way, you've got Clarence Thomas, who was appointed by George Bush the First. Antonin Scalia, extremely entertaining member of the court, brilliant, funny, sarcastic, very conservative. He and Thomas very frequently vote together. He too was appointed by George Bush the First. Anthony Kennedy, another Republican. So far, it's all Republican going this way. Anthony Kennedy was, I forget, I think he was appointed by George Bush the First too. He's a nice Catholic boy from Sacramento, served on the Court of Appeals and the Ninth Circuit, and then was promoted to the Supreme Court. Mentioning Catholics reminds me that on the current Supreme Court, there are 6 Catholics and 3 Jews, and not a single Protestant. Throughout American history, traditionally, the court was composed entirely of Protestant, white men. And now you've got a slightly more diverse court, but religiously completely skewed with 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. Does that affect their decision-making? I don't know. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a Democrat and appointed by President Bill Clinton, been on the court for a long time now. Let me go to the middle here. Stephen Breyer from San Francisco. His dad was counsel to the school board in San Francisco, also appointed by Bill Clinton. And no tiger on the First Amendment, as we'll see. He's too much of an accommodationist. He wants to find compromise and so on, which is dangerous in the First Amendment area. Joseph Alito, another George W. Bush appointee, deeply conservative, cautious, fearful man. And then the new kids on the block, the 2 appointments of President Obama, first Sonia Sotomayor, the first Latina in the court, and Elena Kagan, who came from the Harvard Law School. She was dean of the Harvard Law School and then served as Solicitor General of the United States, that is, the lawyer for the government who argues the government's case in the Supreme Court. And this is her 2nd year on the court. It's important to understand who these folks are and what animates them and what they respond to in the way of argument for our purposes, dealing with freedom of speech and the press, because the First Amendment means what the Supreme Court says it means, no less and no more. This will be corny, and I'll only do it to you one more time, but I want this to sink in. Repeat after me, follow the bouncing ball. The Supreme Court means what? No! I can't even read. The First Amendment means. All right. What the Supreme Court says it means. Don't ever forget that. Actually, it's not quite accurate, because the First Amendment means what a majority of the justices on the court says it means. If 5 of them, of the 9, say it means the First Amendment protects the right of the occupied people to put their tents in public squares as a means of protest, then the First Amendment protects the occupied people. But if 5 say it doesn't, then the First Amendment doesn't mean that they're protected. The court this term has 2 major First Amendment cases that you should know about, and we'll take a close look at in the course. Last Tuesday, the court heard argument in the case involving the FCC's rules, the Federal Communications Rules, on indecent speech by broadcasters, the use of dirty words or nudity on radio and television, over-the-air broadcast radio and television. The argument did not go very well from my perspective, and Justice Sotomayor seems to be sitting this one out. She has recused herself for reasons that I don't know. She might have had something to do with the case when it was in the lower court. But the decision will certainly come down this spring, at the latest in June. What I'm hoping is it comes down before we reach that part of the course in which we consider the constitutionality of the FCC's rules on indecency and other governmental attempts to police sexual speech, basically. And most of those governmental attempts have been aimed at the internet, trying to contain sexual content on the internet. The other really interesting case that the court has this spring involves a man named Alvarez from down in Orange County, who was elected to the county water board, and at the first meeting introduced himself, and he says, I'm a veteran, I served 27 years in the Marines, I was wounded, I forget how many times, shot in the back, and I received the Congressional Medal of Honor for that. None of which was true, with outright lies that the man told. And he was prosecuted by the federal prosecutor for violating a law that makes it a crime to falsely represent that you have received the Medal of Honor. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco, decided that that law violated the First Amendment. And the government took the case to the Supreme Court. The argument in that case is set for February 22nd. If they don't decide it, if they decide it too quickly, it's going to screw me up, because what I want you to do is write a paper about that case, reporting what the decision is and who decided what in that case. That'll be your paper assignment, unless the court decides the case too quickly, in which case we'll have to cook up something else. But that case, too, will be decided before the end of June at the latest. So that's the First Amendment news from the court. Today, the court may decide to take at least 1, maybe 2 cases involving the speech of school children, online speech, where they say something on their Facebook page that trashes the principal of their school, for example. And those kinds of cases have been percolating up to the court in recent years, and the court may decide today to take one of the cases that is sitting there. And there's all kinds of recent ferment in the free speech First Amendment world. There's a rich vein of new material for us to work with. Last year, as you may have noticed, the court decided that violent video games can't be prohibited by the state of California. Then there was the funeral protester case that we'll look at that was decided a year before that. There's all this Occupy business around the country, and the court has spoken to issues like that, though not involving Occupy. Then there's Citizens United, the now infamous decision of the court 2 years ago to allow corporations to spend unlimited money in political campaigns. That will take up, I guess, the end of next week. There's the WikiLeaks phenomenon, which is still a live issue. To assist you in understanding all this, we've got 2 books, Figures of Speech, which in a stunning coincidence I happen to have written. And you should get it because it covers most, if not almost all, of the issues that that we'll consider in the course. By the way, who are these people? Anybody recognize the heroes and villains who are pictured here? No? All strangers? Well, on the left is Earl Caldwell, who was a reporter for the New York Times back in the late 60s and early 70s, whose beat was the Black Panther Party. And he sort of interpreted the Black Panthers to the white world through the New York Times. And the FBI came around and subpoenaed him to come down to a federal grand jury in San Francisco and spill the beans about everything he learned from the inside of the Black Panther Party headquarters in Oakland, and to disclose all of his notes and everything that he had accumulated on the Black Panthers. He claimed a First Amendment right not to be subjected to coerced disclosure of confidential source information. That case went to the Supreme Court with an unhappy outcome that you can read about in the book. Next is a young George Carlin, the satirist comedian, whose 7 Dirty Words monologue we will listen to carefully later in the course, do some content analysis, as he did, of each of the expletives that were his favorite. It's that 7 Dirty Words monologue that gave birth to the FCC's regulation of indecent speech on radio and television, which is at stake in the case that's now in the Supreme Court. And then you've got the older gentleman here, one of the most famous Supreme Court justices of all time, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who flip-flopped on the First Amendment. And back in the first days, really, of serious First Amendment consideration by the court, 1919, in the aftermath of World War I, Justice Holmes decided 3 cases saying that the government could prosecute people who were opposed to the war or opposed to the draft or circulated socialist or communist pamphlets, that they didn't have any First Amendment rights to do any of those. And then later in 1919, as you'll read in this wonderful book, he changed his mind and started to dissent in those cases. And his dissents were so eloquent and so persuasive that over time, they became the law. They attracted the majority of the justices of the court, and now those decisions, those early decisions in 1919, would be rejected out of hand as bad First Amendment law because of Holmes' eloquent opinions. And then on the far right, is a young Larry Flynt, the world's leading pornographer, who has basically been a First Amendment nut all of his life in trying to defend his livelihood as publisher of Hustler magazine and producer of innumerable dirty videos, and has been in trouble with the authorities on and off for several decades. But he had one tussle with the leader of the moral majority at the time, the Reverend Jerry Falwell. And that's one of Flynt's cases that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where Falwell sued Hustler for running a fake ad that featured Falwell having sex with his mom in an outhouse, which was deeply offensive to Falwell, of course, and probably to most people. But the Supreme Court decided that Hustler and Flynt had a First Amendment protected right to say those things about Falwell. It's a very important decision. And then, besides the little book, we've got the course reader. Did anybody get the reader yet? You got it. They got it. They printed it. All set. Okay, you get it at Copy Central up the street here at the intersection of Euclid, on Hearst at the intersection of Euclid, and it has the syllabus. If you didn't get a syllabus, the syllabus is online on the DSpace site, and the second thing after the table of contents in the reader is another copy of the syllabus. I get these things right away because there's an assignment for Thursday, and one of the things that I recommend that you do early on is get real familiar with the glossary in the reader, my handy glossary of legal stuff. This is not a law school course by any means, but it's inevitable that there's going to be some legal terms, and here's what you ought to understand about them. I've always been baffled in this course that come midterm, or even final, worse than final, and people will not understand a term like the very first thing in here, actual malice, and they think it has something to do with malice, being actually malicious, hating somebody, something like that, and that, of course, is not what it means at all, as defined by the United States Supreme Court in the famous case of New York Times versus Sullivan. But here's what you need to know about actual malice, right there in the glossary. So use it frequently, often. Hardwire it into your brain in the neuroscience building. Okay, other housekeeping matters, office hours. They keep fooling with me about where my office will be. They have now assigned me to 259 Evans. That's different from 442. Don't ever go to 442. It's a little dark closet where the door doesn't work. 259 Evans is the office they have assigned me to. But don't go there unless you let me know ahead of time, because that's way the hell gone from here. And it seems too long of a trek to get from here to there and waste all that time walking. So what I intend to do is, as soon as they finish renovating the Pat Brown Cafe over in the plant biology building, that's going to be my office. So if you want to talk to me in office hours, which are the hour right after class, here's what you do. You can email me ahead of time. I highly recommend that, and say, hey, I'd like to see you after class Tuesday. And then catch me at the end of class, and we'll walk over there together, sit down, we may have a cup of coffee or whatever, and talk about whatever you want to talk about. Don't assume that I'll be sitting in 259 Evans or in the Pat Brown Cafe unless you let me know that you want to talk to me, either by emailing me ahead of time or by catching me at the end of class. Because, if I go up to 259 Evans and sit there, I get lonesome, and nobody comes to see me, I'm going to go home. I've got other things to do. So let me know if you want to see me. I recommend, if you have questions that are of general interest, questions about the cases, about the issues, that you post them on BSpace, on the forums feature of BSpace, under general discussion. And I'll answer them. Maybe some of you will answer each other's questions. That's great. I encourage you to do that, or to stir up some discussion there. Use it as virtual office hours. I expect you guys to check BSpace at least once a week. I check it virtually every day to see what's going on and respond to questions that are there. So use it. If you have a question that's personal to you, or specific in some way that you don't want to post for all the class to see, just email me directly. We'll try to answer. And we can't do that, then we'll meet for office hours. Hard to characterize the style of the teaching that I do. As I say, I basically was a lawyer, not a professor, although I guess I taught at Cal longer than most professors here. But I don't know how they do business, and I'm so remote from your experience as undergraduates, I don't know what your expectations are. I just do what I know how to do, and it may not be consistent with your expectations. I do some lecturing, but I greatly encourage you to ask questions as we're going along. I mean, just raise your hand and we'll clear it up right there on the spot. I'll say something that is unintelligible to you. Doesn't make any sense. I may misspeak as I did a few moments ago. Well, let's get that cleared up, because there are no sections in this course. There are no GSIs. And everything has to be resolved either here in class or on BSpace. And it's, no GSIs, no TA. You may not remember Austin Powers 2 years ago, the comic figure who said, it's just you and me, baby. So that's all there is. I do use readers to help with the grading of student work, but otherwise you have to deal with me. The approach that I take to each subject is somewhat historical. That is,